Hi, Dr. P here to talk about rules, length, and formatting rules. Is there some rule of thumb about how long rules should be? Not really. Maybe it would be long enough to be thorough, but not longer. Now, in fact, there is a rule of thumb for mass market games, because mass market games must be very simple. And that rule of thumb, as posed by Richard Borg, is no more than 2 pages. Of course, how many words you get on a page depends on the size of the page and what point type you're using. So, in general, with hobby games, being concise is ideal, but it's a really bad idea to reduce the length of the rules just for the sake of reducing the length of the rules, unless you can do it by making the game simpler so you don't need as many rules. That's almost always, a good objective. Make the game simpler so you can make the rules simpler and shorter. But don't make the rules simpler unless the game justifies it. Ask yourself, what's worse? Longer rules or rules that don't cover everything? Of course, at that point you can ask, how robust is your game? That is to say, how likely is it to play pretty well even if the people don't play it quite right? If a game is robust, people can play it not quite the way it was intended to be played, and it turns out pretty well. If it's not very robust, if they get the rules wrong, then it doesn't work. It doesn't work well. So, use a little sense here. The longer the game, the longer the rules are likely to be. Long rules in a 15-minute game don't make sense. On the other hand, if your rules are quite short and your game is quite long, what's going on? Surely you can find some way to reduce the length of the game if the rules are relatively short, can't you? Or maybe your rules aren't thorough if they're fairly short for a long game. They're not covering everything. Think about it in those terms. Now, here's a little story recently I ran across, or had happened to me actually, about rules that were kind of long. I submitted a game which is a Scrooge-style zombie game to a publisher. He remarked that the rules seemed long. I was surprised. Well, they were laid out in single-space normal type, not as though they were a finished rule book, because I don't do the layout, because that's something publishers generally want to do themselves. And so it looked much like the sample rules that I include with this course. Now the font in normally typed printed material is somewhere between 10 point and 12 point. I use 11 point. And the font used in printed rules tends to be smaller. So other things being equal, the rules are going to look longer when they're printed out in a normal format rather than laid out as though it was a rule book. Anyway, I checked my word count and it was about 4,300 words. Then I looked up online the rules for Munchkin and for Bang, both really well-known Scrooge games, and both of them were over 4,900 words. So my rules were not so long then. They were shorter than the rules for Munchkin and Bang. But they looked long to the publisher. Now, I don't format rules as though they were going to be printed for a game, and maybe I should. But I know the publisher is going to do it their way, and they're going to use experts, and I'm not an expert, so I haven't been doing the final layout. In general, folks, short rules are better than long if the game is simple enough to warrant short rules. Use common sense.